and welcome to the interviews with speakers who are speaking at our conferences and also have something interesting that they've done in the past and something that they would like to kind of cover in detail in the sessions at SmashingConf. And today I'm very happy and pleasant and honored to have Miriam with us. Miriam, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you, Vitaly?
I'm doing wonderful considering that my wallet got stolen yesterday. I'm very, very happy.
Oh,
But I was very surprised, Miriam. I was very surprised. You know, your talk the talk's title is CSS is red. And when I think about developers and when I talk to
hmm
developers, they then have slightly different view of CSS. You know, sometimes they want to lock down CSS in CSS and GS or install components and leave it be
yeah,
and kind of avoid the cascade and all of that. So CSS among developers is not necessarily considered to be red. So
yeah.
what would you say about that?
Well, that's why I named the talk CSS is rad. I was referencing the CSS is awesome meme uh, that people have likely seen, but also I think CSS and the things that make it strange all come out of this radical vision for um, a web that falls apart really gracefully across any devices and unknown devices. We can create new devices that can access the web, and whatever interface they provide, whether that's audio or text or a braille reader or any sort of interface, can access this web. And I think that's fundamentally radical. And so I was playing on the two meanings of rad with that. Um, it's both great and it's sort of um, uh, doing something new and exciting. I mean, the web is now almost 30, so new in relation to some things.
Yeah, totally. But I also, you know, it's always for me, I remember this magical moment. For me, it's always, it feels a little bit magical. Like that moment when I realized that I would go on yahoo.com in 1998. That was the time when I got in the web
uh-huh.
first. And I could see that, wow, this is just, you can just click on things and go from one place to something totally different, and you can publish things on the web as well. But as time progressed, of course, CSS has evolved dramatically.
Yeah,
And so if we look at what is happening today, for many developers, it feels like CSS is too unpredictable. So you look into JavaScript
yeah.
where you can write your unit tests and you can do all kind of testing and you can be
hmm
certain that the application is working. How would you even deal with something like testing CSS? It seems to be really complicated.
Yeah. I think there's different aspects to that question. So on the one hand, tools like SAS can help us test the ways that we're writing CSS, right? So if I'm using functions and mixins, if I'm automatically generating some CSS, I can uh, very quickly in SAS or a language like that, I can write um, tests for the logic. Uh, but on the other side, it's a strange thing. Like, what does it mean to test a design? And specifically, what does it mean to test a design that's going to look different everywhere? Um, I'm not even sure what it would mean.
I,
And
I,
we can sort of fake it um, by testing in one place. So often that's like we use headless Chrome and we do some visual regression testing, and that might be useful for capturing a certain case.
right.
But that doesn't tell us, does this work well on a screen reader? Does this work well on a Braille reader? Does this work well when I have Siri read the website to me out loud? Um, and those are all related to CSS. CSS has ways of um, doing things for screen readers and changing how a site is read. And um, I don't think that's a solved problem. I think it
Yeah.
would be lovely if we could, and we are solving it more and more. I mean, Firefox has this. Uh, they can check color ratios now in Firefox DevTools. There's all sorts of. You can see the accessibility tree in Firefox. There's tools like that coming into all the browsers. So there's more of it, but it's sort of a hard question. I think testing CSS is just hard.
Yeah, I think that in many ways what I see many developers trying to do in companies is to be a bit more, kind of get a bit more safety around CSS. So having that feeling that this is why where encapsulation and CSS modules and style components and CSS and JS all come into place, where you just want to be certain that if you change something in CSS, it's not going to break something cascading down somewhere on a page that you haven't accessed for years, right? And that's actually probably, I guess, means some sort of regression testing, but because there is the cascade of CSS and the nature of CSS, it might be really hard to do. So, but what do you think actually about all these things that are trying to tame CSS, like the modules, the style components? Is it something that you adopt as well in your work, or is it something that you kind of see as a separate thing that can coexist potentially with the way you're writing CSS, or even support it in some way?
I think there are, so CSS, the entire idea of the cascade is to help handle those sorts of things. So it's a lot of people have trouble with specificity, find specificity frustrating. Specificity is there specifically to help do that isolation that people are wanting from things like CSS modules or scoped styles. And I don't, and often the CSS and JS solutions actually use CSS specificity and variants on it to solve the problem. So I think they can be tied in. I don't think that they're sort of one-size-fits-all solutions to the problem. I think the cascade is there for a very specific reason, and it is that can we take information from different sources, compile that information, and make some reasonable decisions about it. And the browser is the only part of the system that has all of the info, right? So I, as an author, don't have all the info about what your device can do or what your user preferences are. So I have to make some suggestions, and then the browser has to take my suggestions and your suggestions and put it all together. And there's no way we can get around that. CSS will never solve that problem entirely. We can just keep pushing it closer and closer. So I'm afraid that some of these tools give a false sense of security. We become secure in the idea that this CSS will never break as long as I always load it in Chrome or something, right? And it's a false sense of security. We need to look at actually how is it falling apart in other places. We still have to deal with the cascade. The cascade is still there. It's still a fundamentally important part of how the web works. And really, we need to be, I think the problem is real. This is a hard problem to solve. How do we design for infinite devices without being device specific? What does that even mean? And this is a problem we'll keep trying to solve. But I don't think we can sort of plaster it over and call it done.
Yeah,
we have to keep working on it.
Oh, well, I'm sure we will. I'm sure we will. But also, there's over all these years, there's been so many different approaches of really dealing with CSS. It felt like in the beginning it was all very straightforward and easy, and then we ended up with Smax and BAM. And then we ended up with SAS and with Less and Stylus and all those. And it seems like we add a lot of layers to simple CSS. So maybe just to kind of give an example of how you make sense of it all. As you write CSS, how do you write it? What do you use? Like what kind of preprocessor, post-processors, naming conventions? Just you have to work on a project. What is your choice, as opinionated as it might be?
Right. I generally use SAS. I think SAS is a well-designed language, and there will always be some things that make sense handled on the server and some things that make sense handled in the browser. And so even if I'm using CSS variables, I will also use SAS variables because they work differently. And some will compile on the server and some will compile in the browser, and those are useful differences. So I still use both of those together. And SAS also allows me to have partials and break up my files into smaller pieces and organize them the way I like. And I have a very specific structure that I use from the most generic low-level abstractions to then working down to specific components. And it's down at that very specific component level where I feel like, okay, scoped styles maybe start to make sense when we're really talking about one single component. But in my mind, the goal of CSS is to move everything up into the high-level abstractions and have as little code as possible need to be scoped. So that's sort of roughly how I think about it. In terms of other tools, it sort of depends on what project I'm in. If I'm in a Vue project, I might use Vue scoped styles, but that's not something I use normally on most of my personal projects. I have some other tools that I built for myself in SAS that I use that just help me manage design tokens and things like that. But there's not a lot of other tooling I use. I really enjoy using CSS Custom Properties. There's so much you can do with them.
Yes. So when would you actually use custom properties? When would you use SAS variables?
It depends on whether I need the browser to make the decision for me. So if I need the variable to understand the DOM, to understand the HTML and the structure, and I need the browser to put that together, then I'll use a CSS custom property. And they're great because you can set them one place and then inherit them and then use them. And that's sort of a fascinating, different from anything we've been able to do before in CSS. To say, in this component, I want to store this piece of information, and then I want to use it somewhere in the component. And SAS can't do that. SAS doesn't understand the HTML structure. It doesn't understand the DOM. So we can try to fake it by knowing both, but SAS can't be smart about that. And on the other hand, there are some variables that I just need to store this number, and I'm going to need to reuse this number, and it's never going to change. It's sort of a global constant. Or a color or something like that that's sort of globally constant. I can put that in SAS and compile it on the server, and it works great.
Right. Yeah. So that's actually how we do it as well. So yes, that's good to know. On the other side, what's also kind of interesting is to look at the broader scope of things. So we have CSS Houdini, we have custom properties, CSS custom properties subgrid coming as well. The evolution of CSS has been incredible over the last couple of years, and now I feel like I understand why the talk is called CSS Red after all. And actually, I like CSS anyway, so I'm just pretending here. But when I think about this on a bigger scale of things, it makes me wonder, what does it mean for development? So for many years, we had JavaScript being just skyrocketing, where you want something new in JavaScript, you just write your own polyfill or a transpiler plugin, and then essentially, boom, you can use it next day. In CSS, you need to write a spec, it will take a while until it gets adopted in browsers and so on, and it seems like Houdini is going to solve it, right? But do you feel that we're moving to the world where we would kind of deal with CSS components in the same way we deal with JavaScript modules? We would plug in something maybe from NPM or like repository, configure it with custom properties, plug and play, and boom, and kind of evolve CSS along the way as well.
Yeah, that seems to be the idea behind Houdini, and I haven't played with it a lot because the features I'm most excited about aren't well supported yet. But I'm really curious where that goes, because I think there's some things that are very exciting about that, about being able to access the browser's rendering engine and invent our own CSS. And there's also some big risks to that. In some ways, I think of it as the difference between Sass and post CSS. One is this structured language that we can expect when I move from one project to the next. The language will always work the same. And the other is a tool for writing your own tools. Post CSS doesn't have a consistent language across modules. You combine them in new ways and create your own languages, and that comes with some exciting advantages. You can really create some new things, and some unfortunate disadvantages of readability and compatibility across implementations. And I think Houdini could open up both sides of that, potentially. We could run into problems where Houdini means everybody is using different CSS languages, in a sense. And that could be very confusing.
Yeah, it could be very confusing to browsers and to developers who are going to maintain
Exactly.
this wonderful code long term. So this remains to be seen. So of all those things, though, Houdini, custom properties, grid, subgrid, what are you most excited about these days? What really keeps you awake at night when you think about CSS?
Well, subgrid is very exciting. I mean, grid already has fundamentally changed the way that I can write a layout. Layouts take me, an hour instead of a day to put together, and I have time left over to write fallbacks for other browsers. I think grids are just wonderful. And being able to combine them with floats and flexbox and everything else, we're starting to get this whole system of tools that really let us do layout, and subgrid takes that to a whole nother level. So I'm very excited about that. I would say one of the outstanding problems that we still face is styling forms. And I'm really glad to see that some browsers are starting to work on that. How do we get forms more easily stylable, more consistent across browsers? So that's another thing that I hope is coming down the path. I've also seen browsers working on cleaning up multi-column. We've had multi-column for a long time, but it's been fairly rough and hard to use for much beyond simple text columns. And it looks like that's getting fixed. So I think all of these things are starting to flesh out. And what's really exciting is when we start to put them together. Flexbox is better now that we have grid, now that we can use it just for what it was meant for, and vice versa. They're better for having each other.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And what about the? What I want to ask. What about the CSS regions? I was so in love with CSS regions. Not happening?
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't been following it closely lately. I would love it. It seems interesting. There's some hard problems to solve with it because are the boxes that you flow into? So regions allow you to flow text from one box to another. And then the question is, do you have to put all those boxes in the HTML at the beginning? Or does CSS have somehow create the new boxes? And I think that's sort of where things got stuck, is it wasn't clear how to solve that problem.
Okay, what about the other one? The one that everybody is talking about, like a big elephant in the room, the element media queries.
Element media queries, yeah. I would love it. I don't know. Again, I think it's a problem for browser engineers. Although, I mean, so consistently through the history of the web, we've had things that were problems for browser engineers at one point, and then our systems become faster, more powerful. We create new ways of doing browser rendering, and those problems get solved. So even if it's impossible right now for browsers to implement, that doesn't mean we can't have it in 5 years. So I'm hopeful.
Yeah, me too. I think I was watching a talk by Tab Atkins maybe 3 years ago. He was speaking at Frontiers. He was speaking about the issues that are related to element media queries and why they're so difficult to put together in a spec and so on.
Yeah,
And the rest is this cyclic dependencies and
right.
all those things. So this is a really complicated problem to solve. But hey, with CSS, nothing is supposed to be easy. So that's cool. Talking about,
It's my
yeah.
favorite thing about reading. I love following along on GitHub as the W3C CSS Working Group discusses these issues. You learn so much from watching how they have to think about it, and it's different from how we think about these problems. And you can learn a lot about why we do and don't have different features by reading those conversations.
Yeah, it's interesting how to see them thinking a little bit differently about seemingly obvious and quite straightforward things that we're thinking of. So this is like a little weekend tip, right? Read the
Yeah,
docs.
yeah. I
That's
think a
fun.
month ago I saw them discussing what is the width of a box that doesn't render.
Ooh, this is getting really exciting here. Okay, so some people who might be thinking, okay, this is a little bit too much for me. CSS is cool, but the width of a non-existing box is a little bit different. Maybe before people leave, maybe you could just highlight a little bit about what your talk will be about and the workshop, what they're going to be about in Austin.
Yeah. So the CSS is rad talk is thinking through why do we have these features of CSS that cause problems for people. The overflow that creates the CSS is awesome meme, or the cascade that people are trying to work around. Why do we have these features, and how do we use them uh, to make the web as awesome as it can be? There's sort of different ways that we have to write fallbacks for different features, but I think we get in a mindset of like I write the thing and then I have to go back and rewrite everything for the fallback. And if we can let that go and let go of an idea that I can only use something once it has 90% on can I use, if we let go of those sort of it is or it isn't supported ideas, we can start to think about how do I handle support and non-support at the same time in very little code. So I'm going to be playing with that on stage. How do I write fallbacks quickly while I'm working? How do I test them quickly while I'm working? And see if we can write some resilient CSS without writing all of our layouts 3 times, which I think is the fear people have.
Yeah, that sounds really, really cool. I'm looking forward to it. And the workshop will be, I guess, building up on top of that and going to
Yeah,
extremes into everything you need to know about writing or not writing CSS.
yeah, I think CSS was invented to solve sort of 2 problems. One is that idea of resilience across devices, and the other is an idea of designing with systems, as in we don't have to write out every design property on every element anymore, the way we did with sort of inline styling. Um, and so it's thinking about those 2 problems and what are the tools we have now to solve those 2 problems. Designing with resilience and designing with systems. I'm going to go into lots of detail on both of those.
Oh, this sounds very, very exciting. Well, talking about this and resilience and time, we are almost finished at this point, but I do have to ask you one last thing before we leave
Okay.
you. I'm very curious. So, because you like CSS so much, do you think that you'll still enjoy writing CSS, let's say 20 years from now? Would you still want to write HTML, CSS, and JavaScript 20 years from now? Or would you like to do something else? What do you think?
Um, I would like to do both the whole way along. So already I do other things. I not only have this company where I write CSS, but I have a theater company and a band, and I'm have a novel. So I'm going to keep doing all those things, and I'm going to keep writing CSS, and hopefully I get to keep doing all of the things.
That sounds very, very exciting. Actually, I'm wondering at this point, when is it going to happen finally that somebody who is a front-end developer or front-end designer or UX designer, or I don't know, there are so many titles now, imagine the world where the entire countries are led by ex-front-end designers and developers. That would be interesting. Will happen sometimes because people like designers have empathy and they want to help people and
Yeah,
all of that, and they're also good at solving problems. It should happen at some point, right?
I hope so. I hope that if that happens, it's good. uh, because other places that tech is running the world, I don't feel like we're doing a great job of it. And maybe it's just that it's not designers in charge, but
Yeah.
um, I think our industry has a problem of thinking that we're smarter than the rest of the world, and so um, I don't want to fall into that trap of
Yeah,
believing
I
that
know what
I'm
you mean. But if you ever
smarter than
decide
the
to
people
run,
doing it.
oh, right, you're right. But if you ever decide to run for president, you'll have my full support because
Okay, thank
CSS
you.
people stick together. They always do.
I'll keep
All
that
right.
in mind. Thank you.
All right. I think we're good so far. Thank you so much for your time, Miriam. And
Yeah,
everybody, thank you so much for watching and joining us as well. I hope you will join us in Austin on June 9th and 10th
yeah.
and probably also 8th and maybe even 11th, depending if you go to workshops or not. This might again, thanks so much, Miriam. And I wish you a wonderful, wonderful rest of the day. Signing off. Bye bye, everyone.
Bye.